Welcome back to this series of interviews with conspiracy theory deniers, effectively, people working against the conspiracy theorists. Today I have Evidence Challenge for you. Somewhere. So welcome to this, which is a sort of impromptu, well, semi-arranged discussion about how you came to start debunking conspiracy theories. In your case, mostly anti-vax.
Yeah, so I suppose I started doing this I set this account up in, I think it was August 2019. I was already slightly active on Twitter with my own account, but very, very light usage. And I don't use that very much at all, actually. And in around that time, I think there were two areas I was interested in. One was climate change, and the other was vaccines. And of course, this is pre-COVID. And yeah, it was very much around just challenging some of the kind of wild claims that climate change deniers and anti-vaxxers were coming up with that was fairly new to me. So it just seemed like an interesting area and for a number of reasons. And that's where my journey began. And very interesting that being pre-COVID and seeing how things have evolved since then. But a lot of the underlying patterns are the same.
So what did you start with then? What on Twitter was it that you started?
Yeah, it was Twitter, and it's been pretty much exclusively, in fact, has been exclusively Twitter. I haven't done anything on Facebook or the other social media. I think I'm interested in YouTube, but I think really it was just to see how things developed. And in some ways it was important for me to be anonymous. And Twitter was reasonably easy to do that.
Talking about being anonymous, what are your thoughts on that? So I know you like to be anonymous. Other people like to be anonymous. I use my real name, which is easy to search for, which may not be a great idea. And exactly the same happens on the other side. You get famous conspiracy theorists are not anonymous, and then there are a whole load of anonymous ones on that side too. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. I think, I mean, clearly I stay anonymous, and I'll explain why in a second. I'm kind of slightly ambivalent about it because I think that there are good reasons why people want to stay anonymous, whether it's safety, whether it's for professional reasons, whether they just want to separate their views on a particular subject from other things in their life. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong about that. I think that by preference, I would prefer it if I knew who I'm talking to, knew the person, and actually I would prefer to be able to use my name in real life, but there's a reason why I don't. I think ultimately, though, it's still really about the debate, the weight of the argument, what you're discussing that's important rather than who the person is. Of course, expertise in areas is always helpful, but really for a proper debate or for a good debate, I think it's really about what people are saying as opposed to who they really are. The reason why I stay anonymous is not for myself, really. I'm actually quite combative, and I'd be quite happy to use my name. But I'm a board member of an organisation that has nothing to do with vaccines or climate change. It's in the social care sector. And I'm quite involved with that. Early on, and actually there's more climate change than vaccines, I saw some of the trolls who were attacking other people and calling up the establishments they work for, whether that was in academia or in the commercial world. And I wanted to protect the organisation I work for from those trolls. Particularly because it has absolutely nothing to do with the work that I'm doing on Twitter. So it's more for them than it would be for myself. And in some ways, I think in a way, it feels like I've got not an arm tied behind my back, but maybe working with one less finger by being anonymous. I think it would help actually if I could use my real name.
I think because that was my thought was that maybe using your real name lends a little bit more credibility to you.
Yeah.
But it's difficult to say. And yes, I am aware that David Gorski, whether you know him,
Yes.
people phoned his work and tried to get him fired. So it's not unheard of that
No,
happens.
it's happened to many people, and I can't remember. It's one of the climate people I was involved with at the beginning. She'd had a lot of attacks, and just so many people I know who or have said, at least anecdotally, that their workplaces have been inundated, that they've had complaints made to the board or to chief executives or whoever it might be. And I've got at this organisation, I am on the board. It would just be embarrassing for the organisation as a whole, for no fault of their own or mine, really, for that matter. So I didn't want to distract from the really important work that they do. Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's more credibility if you use your own name and your position. I think when I'm able to, I will use my own name. So I will kind of dox myself. But at the moment, I don't feel it would be fair to the organisation that I work with.
Going to ask everybody whether you make any money from this. I'm guessing probably not in your case because of the anonymity and because it's only Twitter.
Exactly. Yeah, I make literally zero money from it, and I don't really have any intention to make money from it. I don't particularly need to. I am actually toying with, or have been working on towards doing a Substack, and that I think I might get paid for that. I don't even know actually, but it's not an intention to do so. And no, I haven't earned a penny from this. Well, so you're doing it voluntarily. It really costs money because it's quite a bit of time, I guess.
What about the conspiracy theorists? Do you think they manage to make any money from their side?
I think it varies. I think quite a few don't, but I think the main, I see them falling into mainly two main camps. There are people who go out of their way to make money from conspiracy theories, and whether it's anti-vaccine or even flat earthers or whatever it might be, there's an audience for this, and people who are willing to pay money, whether it's through books, whether it's through just watching videos and advertising revenue, whether it's for paying for Substacks. And to my mind, this goes back centuries in some ways. It's a bit like the Medicine Man or the medicine show in the Wild West, snake oil salesman, however you put it. There are people who blatantly and very clearly are out to make as much money as they can by creating as much of a stir as they possibly can. I think there are probably other people who just, like me in some ways, but on the other side, are just vehement about their views. They're not necessarily making any money from it, and they've just got this very strong belief in a particular area. So I think it's a mixture, but I think the people who really drive this, absolutely are making money.
So what is it that you hope to achieve anyway? So it's not money, and there are very, very strong opinions on the other side that are difficult to shake. What are you trying to achieve?
I think it's multifaceted, like many things. I think there's part of it is to do with my own sense of what's right and what's wrong. That I think that misinformation and disinformation particularly is harmful, particularly in the medical space, but long term, whether it's climate change or just actually rational thinking. So I think that there's part of this is about helping people to make the right decisions or better decisions, and helping them to come to the right decision, not forcing people. The second one is just generally about rational thinking and having perspective. So just helping the debate to be much more enlightened in a way. And I'm a real believer in enlightened thinking, critical thinking, and helping people to have a framework for how you build your understanding, and indeed my own. I also think that you're right. Most anti-vaxxers, vehement anti-vaxxers, are not going to change their mind, or not easily. There are examples, of course, where people have, and that's great. But it's probably much more the much larger audience of people who look in on these debates. And I think it's very easy to underestimate how many people do view from the sidelines. It's a bit like the number of vaccine hesitant compared to out and out anti-vaxxers. It's a much larger group of people who are unsure. And those are the people really we're trying to reach. Persuade to some extent, yes, but at least give them more balanced information. I'm not an absolute zealot about vaccines. I think there are some limitations, and we should always be very careful and keep questioning, but doing that in perspective. And I think the other thing I think is really important from my perspective is not just combating what is being said by anti-vaxxers, but it's bringing the debate back round to the really important big picture. And as you might see from my pinned tweet, which is about the difference between anti-vaxxers and vaccine hesitant, is that I think people who do vaccinate, in the main, in fact, probably all of them, are disease risk aware. So they realise the real reason for taking a vaccine is to combat a disease, often one that we don't see anymore. And it's just reminding people of the big picture, what that is, why that's important, rather than following what anti-vaxxers tend to do, which is to focus on small, what they perceive as small weaknesses and blowing those up. So I think it's really important to bring people back to the big picture.
So what is your background in science, or whatever you can say about that? I know you might not be able to talk about that.
No, I can actually. So I'm not a scientist. I don't have a formal scientific qualification, and actually my degree is in English literature of all things. However, I have a long career in asset management. I have numerous financial qualifications and statistical background. So probably the particular expertise I bring to this is just looking at data, pulling it apart, and again, focusing on the really important parts and being able to say, hang on a second, let's get that in perspective. That's really quite an important point, the point you're making. I'm quite confident about challenging from a data point of view. And I also have quite an analytical approach to things, which is why I got into asset management in the first place. I think also I have a business background. So that might be slightly different from people from an academic background. Of course, a lot of scientists are in the commercial world as well. But having sat on boards and having sat in so many committee meetings, I understand about governance and I understand about the business world. So I'm quite happy to challenge people when it comes to discussions about whether it's BlackRock and Vanguard. I absolutely know I know more than most people in those areas. WEF, all those sorts of conspiracies. I think I can bring a slightly different perspective. And people from those business backgrounds, there are plenty who helped combat disinformation, but maybe it's not as represented as areas such as academics and science. So I don't pretend to understand so much about the medical side. Leave that to the experts, but I think maybe I can bring that different perspective.
How do you choose which battles or which discussions to enter into?
That has changed. So I think early on I was more combative and would just take on anyone. I think increasingly I've learned to block and mute. There are a huge number of trolls, as we all know. People are there to waste your time and are just not going to listen. So I have a kind of rule to myself that I'll pick something that I think people are maybe going to listen to, more because there's some sort of factual basis to it, as opposed to just a completely baseless allegation that's made. There's no point in, someone just says, "Oh, WEF." Well, there's no conversation to be had there. But if there is even a nugget of fact or data or information that's being used, and I think that might resonate with some people, I'll challenge it. But I have a rule now that it's kind of free and out. So if they keep arguing back with either baseless allegations or changing the subject, as they often do, as soon as they're challenged, after three interactions, I'll just then mute them or block them. Usually mute, actually, or just move on without doing that, because it's pointless after that point.
It's also an interesting balance question, because there's a continual discussion on whether blocking somebody is effectively losing the argument. It is sort of the Twitter equivalent of calling somebody Hitler.
I don't know. I don't subscribe to that. I think if it's of course, blocking someone is closing the door on ongoing conversation. I block people who are just absolutely not interested in having a discussion at all. So either they're sea lioning, they're either wasting your time by just reeling you in and keep peppering you with questions, and they're really acting in bad faith, or they're just pumping out misinformation and not interacting at all. There are some accounts I've blocked on that basis, or that they're probably the main one I will block are people who are just abusive, and they have nothing else to add. So I don't know if they're bots or not, but what's the point? Could I mute them? Yes, I could, but they keep seeing your stuff. You've probably been in the same position. You have someone who just spray paints your profile. They'll just go onto every tweet you've made in the last few days and just keep going and going and going at you. You have to get rid of these people somehow, and then they'll set up alternative accounts once you've muted them. So I prefer to block them so that they're less likely to be able to come at you. I think that probably happens when there are pylons. So no, I don't think there's anything wrong with blocking per se. In some ways it's a bit like free speech. You're free to also close the door on someone. That's not denying free speech.
On that theme, I just thought of another topic. There seems to be a trend recently of to a certain extent, the anti-vax community taking up evangelist tactics, which will be changing the topic, jacking off, so just asking questions that don't go anywhere and never engaging in the discussion, which you seem to be mentioning there. Have you noticed that coming up, or am I imagining it?
No, I have. I mean, I think it's a tactic that's always been there to some extent, but I'm seeing an increase of it. And I take that as a sign that in some ways we're winning the war, not necessarily individual battles, but I think over time people have just got so used to the conversations and the data and the arguments back and forth. I think people have seen so often that, people like you and me and the groups who challenge with evidence, those arguments have been had already. So I think they are often then trying to change the subject as much as and more quickly. And as I said, I think generally that means that over time we're winning those wars, and that people are coming round. One thing I've noticed is vaccine hesitancy poll numbers. You would expect those to go up during something like a pandemic as we've had, and the biggest anti-vax campaign and crusades we've ever seen. And it really hasn't changed opinions much. There's been an increase in the number of people who are very distrustful of vaccines. That's probably come from people who are undecided before. but in the main, there's been very little difference. Certainly, the UK polling figures I've looked at, and I suspect as the vaccine thing starts to dissipate, and we move on to other vaccines and other diseases, that confidence will return again. So I think from a rational perspective and from an overall sense of whether vaccines are positive or negative, I think over time I'm confident that will come back. What little gain that they've had.
Although that does lead me into another interesting side, because just over the other side of the big pond, there's a person pretending to be a Democrat. What's he called? Kennedy.
Kennedy, yeah, yeah.
Who is on the rise. It's hard to tell whether they're also pumping their numbers by saying, yeah, everybody agrees with me. And maybe won't do as well as they imagine, just like politicians, some notable politicians in the UK did, Corbyn, for example. But still, there's a danger that might not go away for a while, as it's in their politics right now.
I agree, and that's a good question. So yeah, I've been aware of him from before COVID, actually very much around measles. So the first vaccine I was talking about was measles, which was coming under a lot of attack pre-COVID, and then there was a whole thing in Samoa, which was awful, with those children dying, and there's a whole storyline there, but he's clearly been involved with the anti-vaccine movement, and I think people have, because he's been trying to pretend or give the impression that he's not anti-vax, which I think is interesting. Yeah, I think it's dangerous. I think it's dangerous that you have people with such a high profile who are clearly trying to get into this. Another one is Vivek Ramaswamy. It's on the Republican side. He is a climate change denier. Well, he calls it a hoax, and those sorts of people are dangerous. I think it does provide a lightning rod, though, eventually for everyone else to turn around and say, no, hang on a bit, that's completely wrong. And it's interesting on the case of Kennedy, he's been at this longer than Vivek, who, what I found really interesting about him is that he's clearly an anti-vaxxer, absolutely clearly. We've known that for over a decade now. But he's been trying to distance himself from the anti-vax movement, and he's been trying to claim he's not anti-vax. And that tells me that he sees that as a vote loser, and that people, ultimately, that's a fight he can't win. Now, it may well be he's trying to do that now and then get into power somehow, or at least have some influence, and then he can kind of roll that back out again. But I think it's very interesting that he has backtracked from that. And we've seen that with a few people, actually, as they start to get more credibility, and as people listen to them more, they then start to play that down, because they know that the mainstream really won't accept that, and they're onto a losing ticket. So I think in the short term, people like Kennedy are very dangerous, but I suspect in the long term, it's not the worst thing in the world. And I've changed my view on that, actually. I think when I first saw him running for president, I thought, oh, this is really bad news. This is really bad news. And it's not great. It isn't great in the short term. It gives succor to the movement as a whole. It gives them something to rally around. But I think longer term, it's no bad thing.
On the idea of people who are nominally anti-vaxxers sort of denying it, or saying, no, I'm not anti-vax, I'm just anti this particular vaccine, which we've seen quite recently. I noticed that is also the case over there in the UK. Some of the GB News crew, particularly Beverly, I can't remember her other name, but Beverly does that too. So that's another thing that maybe has spread from the US. So that leads me on to the other part of the question, which was about, do you think some countries have done better at this than others.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a good question. In terms of combating anti-vaxxers, do you mean in terms of combating?
Well, either that or in terms of education or
Yeah, good
how
question.
many they get.
Um, so my one view I have is that, and some people who follow me and I follow may disagree with this. I very strongly feel that mandating vaccines, except in a very targeted tactical way, so healthcare workers, for instance, I think that mandating vaccines for the population generally is a bad idea. I think it builds vaccine hesitancy and vaccine resistance. And I know this from, so part of my family is French. I'm a half French. And France has had a much more, I don't know if you pick this up in Germany, but in some ways there's a bit of a, not authoritarian, but a slightly more structured, stronger government approach to things in France. And certainly they've had mandatory vaccines in the past, and quite a strong approach to the messaging around vaccines, overly strong, let's say. And France has a very strong anti-vaccine movement and has done for a long time. And I think that's probably as a direct result of that slightly more draconian approach that they take. I actually think the UK, for all its, it's had a pretty disastrous government for several years. But I think the approach that's taken in the UK has been better. I think we have lower levels of vaccine hesitancy. You're always going to have anti-establishment, anti-vaxxers, anti-this, anti-that. You're always going to have some people who are like that psychologically. You're always going to have some people who are just against the system generally. But the level of vaccine hesitancy, I think, is lower in the UK. And I think that's reflected to some extent in a number of people being vaccinated, and in the discourse, generally speaking. I think that's probably also true in Scandinavian countries, but which have maybe taken a slightly more relaxed approach to COVID, but also in places like New Zealand, where they had a strong approach to lockdowns. So I think that's probably a slightly better approach. In terms of education, yeah, I do think public messaging should be stronger around disease risk awareness. I always think that. Again, it's a balance. You don't want to scare people. You don't want to, well, that's not quite true, but you don't want to be over the top, and you don't want to, you want people to be aware, and some of the diseases are scary and some of the implications, and obviously deaths and such like. But I think you don't want shock tactics, but you do want to remind people why we're doing this. And I think sometimes anecdotal evidence could be used more. This is exactly what the anti-vaccine brigade tend to use, are individual anecdotes, particularly with images, highly emotional, often false or fake, but that often has much more powerful impact than numbers. If you say X million people have died, it's a data point for many people. If you show a picture of a child and claim that they're in hospital with tubes up their nose because of a vaccine, even if that's not true, that probably has more impact to quite a group of people. I think we could be more focused on anecdotal evidence with diseases. I've tried to post pictures of meningitis, tetanus, in children or in adults, and showing the impact, just to remind people this is what it looks like, because we don't see it anymore, do we? So I think sometimes that visceral view is as important as the data points that we use.
Well, in a similar but related subject, I can't remember who it was, but I fielded some people that were very enthusiastic about drinking raw milk. And that's the same thing. I don't think I've ever seen anybody, I think I did when I was a child, but I don't remember it, who had brucellosis, which is what you get if you drink raw milk. So we're not familiar with the things that can happen.
No, we're not. I've got a neighbour up the road, and he had polio very, very young, and he has a really withered arm. I mean, and it's actually worse than a lot of the photos I've seen in his case, and shortened. And that was polio, and people just do not see that anymore. And he says, I'm one of the lucky ones. Sure, he said it slightly through bravado, but he knew people who, or didn't, he knew of people who died of polio. And certainly my French grandmother, who was a teacher, they lost one pupil they lost one a baby, an infant, to one of the brother of one of the girls that she was teaching. That's a long time ago, but yeah. And we don't see these things, do we?
We don't see polio. Well, it's not long ago that it was normal for children to be exposed to death at a young age, and these days,
yeah, exactly. That's right. I mean, the reason why life expectancy has increased so much, almost entirely down to reduced infant mortality. The average age of adults dying has gone up a little bit, but not massively. It's almost entirely down to us preventing younger people from children and younger people from dying from these diseases. And we have to remind people of that and kind of show people what these things look like. And they are horrific, but yeah, it's just something you don't even see it read about it at school.
So I think we've covered most of the things I wanted to do, but there are a couple of aspects. One of them is I know it's probably not so strong in the UK, but maybe you could talk about that. It's the distribution between the left and right of politics and reality deniers, let's call it. So all people that are denying reality.
Yeah. So sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to finish the question. So fine, if you got it, go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that is a really interesting conversation. I mean, it's very clear to me that when you get under the surface of a lot of the debate, so you start off with an anti-vaxxer making a claim about whatever it might be, whether it's D-dimer or various proteins or something they've jumped onto that they really don't fully understand, and I don't always understand them, but what I do, which often puts me at an advantage, is just read the source. A little tip for everyone: just read it. You'll know more than most people who are commenting, and quickly it descends into a political battle. They'll quickly reveal the fact it's you libtards or whatever it might be. At this point, it seems to me it is almost entirely right wing. That hasn't always been the case. In fact, when I remember thinking about anti-vaxxers going back, many years ago, were actually tended to be more left wing, tended to be more on a bit like alternative health and kind of wellness, as we call it now. But that's back in those days, the kind of hippie brigade who were very skeptical about mainstream medicine and mainstream media, actually tended to have more of a bias towards the left. I think that is very much more on the right side now. Myself, I'm pretty much in the centre. I voted for all three main parties in the UK at different times, and would do again. I tend to go towards who's more centrist. I think there is no question, particularly in the US, that it is a strong identification of your political bias towards the Republicans or the Democrats. And I had read and read the background to this, data points around how you can identify Republicans against Democrats on a whole host of policies, including taxation, things that you would normally think are political. And I think the strongest correlation, of course, we all know about correlation, but this seemed pretty strong, was climate change denial, actually, of all things. I don't know. I don't know if the vaccines were included in this, but I suspect they probably are quite linked as well. But climate change denial was a stronger predictor of whether someone was Republican or going to vote Republican than anything else, which I found remarkable. So yes, it has been completely politicized, which I think is a real shame because, of course, rationally it shouldn't be about politics at all. It really shouldn't. It should just be based on your attitudes towards risk. There might be something around mandating, as I mentioned before, and about how policy is impacted. But whether you believe that vaccines are safe or not, or whether they're effective, it really shouldn't have any political bias at all if you are looking at it from a rational point of view.
Yes, so that was maybe in the past in politics, even not that long ago with Reagan, for example. You might not agree with their policies, but you would agree that they took reasonably good scientific advice.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely. And that's it feels that, that kind of belief or listening to experts, healthy skepticism is very important, and just checking things, absolutely right. But uncritical skepticism just because it's from authorities is just, it's infantile. It's pathetic, and it's very easy to dismiss from a rational point of view or from an adult perspective, but actually very difficult to argue with when someone's just not willing to engage rationally. I think, though, as soon as you start discussing things with people rationally, even if they're not, their responses aren't always rational themselves, even if they start off with some fact and they've clearly read into it, you're already on the right conversation. I've just read a really good book by Steven Pinker called Enlightenment Now, and he makes this point time and time again. It's why he's an optimist about kind of our continued world position on progress and on enlightenment, is that as soon as people start engaging in a conversation or a rational debate, even if they're almost taking an irrational position, they have started debate in the right area. So I'm positive actually about the future, but I think, of course, it's going to be bumpy, and we always need to be bringing people back to evidence, bringing people back to the big picture, bringing people back to the impact of what people are saying.
So to finish off, I've messed up with my timing because I wanted to ask you where you first came across the idea of debunking, in your case, flat earthers, or was it climate change? So where you first came across the idea or thought of the idea yourself, and then how you see it going in the future. So maybe start with first.
Yeah, so on occasionally climate change, probably I had a slightly stronger affinity to it because working in asset management, of course, the world has been moving more towards ESG. And I could talk a lot about ESG. It's actually, ESG is mainly about risk management. It's nothing to do with whether you ethics and such like, or very little to do with it. And looking at the real risks of climate change, whether or not you believe it's man-made or not, what are going to be the financial consequences, both for companies, for economies, for for future funding. So very much from a pure financial point of view. And then when I saw on Twitter a lot of the just absolute ridiculous comments that were being made about economic impact and some of the pseudo statistics, and that's my background again, I just thought this is, I know this stuff and this is just ridiculous. So I probably started there. And then quickly you could see people talking about vaccines. My father was a GP actually. So I knew a little bit about medicine, and I'd seen some of the discussions we had in the past. And he was broadly pro-vaccines. Again, no, he wasn't an evangelist. And knowing some people in the medical profession as well that I happen to know, it just makes no sense to be against vaccines. per se. Specific things, yeah, maybe that might be problematic, but just to be completely anti-vaccines generally is a ridiculous position to be in. So yeah, so that's why I think I started on in that area. Sorry, the second part of your question.
Well, where do you see it going? So particularly, I guess Twitter or X, as it's now called. What do you see that becoming in the future?
Well, yeah, Twitter's another thing. Particularly if he makes everyone pay for it in future, which is what he's suggesting. That'll be interesting. That's a point of no return. On as far as the anti-vaccine thing is concerned, anti-vaccine movement will always be around, and it will morph, and it will be anti probably cancer therapies in the future. I think that's where we'll see a lot of development with mRNA particularly. So that will probably become the new thing.
That's where the mRNA is going.
Exactly. And I said a tweet a long time ago, at the point where anti-vaxxers who have been diagnosed with cancer then have a decision to make about whether they take an mRNA treatment, that's going to be a very sobering moment for them. And I suspect that's why, again, I'm an optimist, because there will be more and more things they can't avoid that affect them personally, or actually even more members of their family. So I think progress will outgun anti-vaxxers' belief systems. I think to my mind, there's no question about that. It's helping the people who are on the edge again, who are not sure, helping them along, so that we can, so one I'm particularly close to, I feel very strongly about, is HPV vaccine and cervical cancer and the other cancers related to it. We could pretty much get rid of most, if not all, cervical cancer quickly if we have high enough vaccination rates amongst girls and boys. The more we allow anti-vaxxers to go unchallenged is very emotive with children. The longer that's going to take, the more people who will die unnecessarily from really horrific disease. So that's why it's important to continue to challenge, I think. And actually, just going back to your points as well, which I forgot to mention about the it's just this vaccine. And again, these are some of the points I think it's always worth bringing out. If they were genuinely only against the mRNA vaccine, because that's been tested and such like, why wouldn't they be banging the drum for using Chinese-produced vaccines that are not mRNA? I think they're killed virus vaccines. There are 2 or 3 of them. I think Sinopharm or whatever. They'd be banging the drum about using those. They don't. And as they don't, and particularly when you point that out to them, as I have done many times to some of the anti-vaxxers, they just ignore it. Clearly, they're anti-vaccine. As soon as you produce that, it's a bit like ivermectin. Why aren't you banging the drum for one of the dozens and dozens of other treatments that were not found to be effective? Why don't you mention them? They don't, of course, because ivermectin and HCQ are political.
Those are the ones that just caught their
Trump.
Vote.
It was Trump and a few other politicians who were pushing it. I suspect, particularly from Brazil, because they were producing ivermectin there and making a lot of money from it. So yeah, it was purely political. Why don't they use? It's like dexamethasone initially. Why weren't they banging the drum for that? Which turned out to be very effective and is actually cheaper than ivermectin. But they never actually mention that because it's not part of the narrative that they're involved with. So same with the vaccine, the mRNA thing, you can challenge them back by saying, well, there are other vaccines around that are traditional vaccines. Why aren't you saying we should be using them?
I think that tactic that you're saying there worked pretty well in the UK with the original. What is it, MMR vaccine that they said that the government just said, yeah, okay, if you pay us, I think it was about £20, you can have separate vaccines for all 3.
Yeah.
If that's the deal. And there's no vaccine in it anyway, and there hasn't been for 20 years. So that argument is fake.
Exactly.
it knocked. I had the feeling that it worked pretty well in that case. That it knocked most of those arguments out. Although hard to tell.
No, I think it did. I mean, of course, famously, Wakefield was one of the people trying to develop single vaccines as well, wasn't he? So, yeah.
Yeah, that gets back to who's making the money.
Exactly.